We ended our last segment with you pausing and then writing 5 slogans for your memory bar. So I really encourage you when we hit these little exercises to actually pause and stop and try to do that little exercise, because these types of exercises really can help you to remember the material. In other words, if you did this exercise and took it seriously and have fun with it, you are going to remember the big five much better. You have to look within those clusters to come up with good ideas for slogans. And once you start working with them in a way like that, you really remember the material better. Okay. Okay, and ending our theory part today, we need to talk about Walter Mischel. And I told you before that Walter Mischel wrote a scathing criticism of the field of personality psychology. Um, that kind of paralyzed it for a little bit until people collected themselves, researchers did, and looked closely at this very constructive criticism, at the constructive part, and, um, and the field of study became even stronger after that. Okay? And for that. But what happened was, especially after, if you could think about it with Gordon Allport starting that nomothetic approach. In other words, first coming up with this idea, we can take any trait we want, we can measure people on it, right, on a continuum, and then try to see if it correlates with behavior. In other words, if we're going to predict behavior, we have to be able to show that it correlates. Okay? And people were kind of jumping the gun on that. So we had a lot of researchers then that were publishing papers saying, well, look, I measured this trait and it correlates with this behavior. And I measured this one, it correlates with that. But first off, you know, these correlations tended to be pretty small, not very impressive. They tended to be somewhere between zero point 0.3 and zero point 0.4. So not the most impressive correlations. Hey, next, they really weren't showing high reliability and validity in these measures that they came up with. And so Walter Mischel was pointing out how that reliability and validity could become stronger. Some of the things that you can do to increase reliability and validity, and encouraging psychologists to be fussier, and to insist upon scales that had higher reliability and validity. And also some people were just plain misusing scales. So an example would be using the MMPI to make a diagnosis. I mean, you're not going to use that by itself, certainly anymore. After his criticism came out, people really realized, that this was jumping the gun, and that this is just one tool amongst many, and that there are other more important tools to use in making a diagnosis, but that it's a great one just for flags, as we discussed earlier under testing. Hey, going back, so, he comes up with ideas for the low reliability and validity. He talks about reliability tests and validity tests, and now how many a scale must go through in order to get the APA stamp of approval since then. So you know that from our testing lecture. Hey, he talked about the misuse of scales and their proper use. We talked about the MMPI, but you can imagine that misuse of scales was also clearly seen at first with the PF16 questionnaire. And so the 16PF questionnaire, and the idea there being it was at first being used to determine the best employee, when that's silly. In retrospect, when you look at it, of course, things like, the interview, the education, the experience being more important, a lot of things being more important. That Um, the scale itself, the importance of that scale comes in after you have a short list of your most highly, equally qualified candidates. Um, but then when we get to this idea of weak correlates, okay, then he talked about something in particular that you saw somebody forecast earlier, right? So remember that this idea of interaction with the press was really a forecast of Michelle's criticism, because Michelle said, you have got to look at the social situation. Okay, there are two determinants to behavior, and only one of them is personality, and the other one is the social situation. And there are some situations where the social situation can even be more powerful, not just equal to personality and its effect, but more powerful. You have got to look at the interaction between the two to get any decent, sized correlations. In other words, in order to be able to predict behavior better at a more appropriate level, more acceptable level. Okay. He also gave some very constructive advice about how to tackle the low reliability and validity problem here. And one idea in particular I really want to go over, because it extends the idea of these personality tests for reliability and validity that we talked about before, is this idea to aggregate behaviors and to paraphrase within your scales. Remember that. The word scales means test. So within your personality tests, what is he talking about here? Well, first off, you might have noticed just in the personality test you've seen so far that oftentimes they ask about behaviors. Do you do this or do you do that, right? And what Walter Mischel was pointing out is that the personality trait that is being measured, remember, validity means, are you measuring what you claim to be measuring? So the personality trait you claim to be measuring, okay, is, again, like a pie. You can think of it, the whole concept, that whole trait, as being like a pie. And so there are many aggregate behaviors. There are many tiny behaviors that you need to aggregate, right? You need to capture as many of them as possible. So, this is going to add to the number of items on your scale. And that is why when you have something like the Big Five, you've got 240 questions or items, on your scale. But you've got to aggregate behaviors, because you can't determine this by one or two or three behaviors. It's got to be all the behaviors that you can think of that really, help to kind of create this concept of this trait. And he also talked about the need to paraphrase. So if you've ever taken a test, maybe you've taken the Big Five already now, or one like that, a really long personality test. And because of that, you might have noticed that they seem to be asking the same thing again and again. So maybe 3 different times throughout the test, they seem to ask the same question, but they just worded it a little different. Well, Walter Mischel actually pointed out the need to do this, because how people interpret one single item can vary too much. Okay? Just because of the wording, people can interpret it to mean something different. And it's better to ask 3 different ways and then take the mean of their 3 responses, okay, is much more valid way of measuring each of those, for instance, each of those aggregate behaviors, right? And again, the response was to make the field stronger. Okay, people really took the advice. We tend to see longer tests now. When we see these shorter forms, like the ones you've been taking for this class, it's because of just for one single trait, right? But even then, they tend to be like 20 items, sometimes even more. Okay. And when we tend to see bigger tests like the Big Five, tend to be like 240 items. Okay. There was another very interesting response to Michelle's criticism, and that was before that, we tended to see a lot of separate social psychology graduate programs and personality psychology graduate programs. But after that, as you can imagine, this idea that you're going to get the best results if you look at both at the same time. Okay, we now see more of these programs combined. So combined to say social dash personality graduate program. So you, for instance, if you are interested in just social psychology, you can, sorry about that. So now if you are interested in actually applying to a graduate program down the road in psychology, and you're interested in social psychology, you can apply to those. There are also very, very few, okay, but there are some programs that are just personality psychology. So there's a lot of social programs, and there are a few that are just personality. But there's also many that combine the two of them. So I actually, when I began my program at Purdue University, it was social dash personality, where you can get your degree in both. Purdue has gone to just social since then, so that has changed since then. Now, we are going to, with the next segments, we're going to be looking at research. So we've been looking at theory, and now we're going to turn over and look at some really cool research that has come out of these different approaches. So this is just a coming attractions kind of a list. Okay. We're going to look at research that explores personality in the work environment. What are employers looking for in personality now? We're going to look at personality in marriage. Okay, we're going to look at the Big Five and other species of animals. Other species of animals? How do you do that? Have them take a pen and pencil measure? We're going to look at that. We're going to look at type A, type B personality. So many of you already know about this concept of, might have heard of type A personality, but we're going to look in particular at what they mean by type A and type B and some of the research that has come out of that. What does your Facebook page reveal about you? Hey, we're going to be looking at brand new research just coming out on that new avenue. Okay. We're going to look at trait profiling, for instance, for smokers, for drinkers, even for serial killers. Okay. And then we are going to look at your economic personality. In other words, what does your credit card statement say about you? But those are some of the interesting areas of research that we're going to be looking at in our next segments of the trait approach.